As we continue to look at what are some cool things that we can do with SSH servers, realize that one of the other cool things that you can do with an SSH server is log into a computer. I could log into a server remotely without a password. All right, so passwordless authentication is something that's possible. It is possible that you could log into a computer without a password using SSH. So as a remote connection, that's something that you could possibly set up. So let's see what that would look like. What would it look like to set up passwordless authentication? And so maybe what I'll do here, just to kind of really emphasize the steps necessary to doing this, is I will generate a new user. So I'll make sure I'm not doing the sandbox user. So maybe I'll make another user on the computer. We've done this before, and this one will not be a privileged user account. So my sandbox user, they can run sudo. I'll remake Bob, in other words. Let's make another Bob user. So sure, I'll do like sudo add user Bob. Okay, fine. And it's going to say, great, we're making a new Bob, /home/Bob. I'll have a silly little password of like password or something like that, right? Just a silly little password I can remember, but I won't even need that password anymore. All right, and I'll just kind of hit enter a bunch of times, right? Okay, great, we just made Bob. Bob is a new user, and I can now log into this sandbox, into my Ubuntu server using the Bob identity. That's now something that's possible. It's like, okay, so if I tried SSHing as Bob, that would work, but it would require me to know the password. Let's give it a try. So over here, if I wanted to SSH to the computer, I don't SSH as sandbox anymore. I could say SSH as Bob. All right, I could do SSH as Bob and then do my 192.168.8.2. It's going to say, okay, what's Bob's password? Okay, I just made a silly little thing, a password. It's like, hey, now I'm logged in as Bob. So if you have other users on the computer, like, yes, SSH is a way that you could go and log in as other users. So we're all the way back to basic user account. Who are the users that can run sudo? What are the things that people can do on your computer? You definitely want to pay attention to all this stuff, of course, right? And if I do a PWD, it's like now I'm in /home/Bob, right? Who am I? I'm logged in as Bob. All right, and when I'm all done acting as Bob, I could type in exit and say, okay, now I'm no longer logged in as Bob. Now, where I want to go with this, though, of course, is I said you can log in as another user using something like SSH without a password. That is possible. Okay, let's see how. How could I do that? Well, I needed another user account. Check. I've got another user account, and the user account actually works. Okay, so what would it take? This is something you would set up on the server side. So on the server, you can configure a user account to allow passwordless authentication, where you will now use keys to log in instead of a password. All right. So in other words, as the administrator, you could set this up for one of your users. So as Sandbox, I'm setting this up for Bob. All right. I'm setting this up for Bob so that someone would be able to log in as Bob without knowing the password. Okay, let's give it a try. How can I do this? And the way, of course, you can do this is by creating some of the necessary files or running a command that will create the necessary files for you. For this activity here today, as we're really emphasizing learning, I'm going to walk through step by step making all this stuff manually. And if we make all this stuff manually, then you can kind of see what the automatic command would do for you. So it's great to learn the automatic commands, definitely, but you want to learn what these commands are doing, especially when it's something so critical as allowing user access to your computer. Okay, so one thing that we're going to want to do is say, okay, I want to allow someone to log into this computer remotely. And if I'm going to allow them to log into the computer remotely using keys, well, I'm going to need to generate some new keys. All right, so maybe I'll get out of /etc/ssh. I'm going to go back to the home directory. Right, I'll cd back to my home directory. Right, so now I'm not generating keys in some critical system location that's running my server itself. What I'm going to do is I'm going to generate some keys, but these are really keys that are meant for Bob. They're meant for the Bob account. They're not meant for everyone who comes to my computer. They're specifically meant for Bob. Okay, so let's see how we could go about doing this. So in my Sandbox user's home directory, I'm going to generate some more keys. And we just saw how we could do that, right? We had sudo, and then we had ssh-keygen. And then I'd have to pick what type of keys do I want to generate. Maybe I'll just stick with the same keys I've been using. If you wanted to use RSA or use ED25519, like these are other acceptable algorithms, I'll keep it simple and just say, hey, we've been using this ECDSA. You want to use ECDSA? That's fine, whatever, as long as the keys are long enough. I'm not going to get all upset about this. ECDSA as we're learning, okay, fine. And where do I want this file to be located? Well, maybe I'll put it here in my home directory, right? I'll say tilde / and the whole point is I'm creating some keys for Bob. So maybe I'll do something like ID _Bob _key. right, to show like, hey, this is for the user Bob, and I'm generating some keys for Bob. Okay, fine. So I'll hit enter to this command. And we'll be able to see, oops, I forgot the dash F. Let's do the dash F on there. Dash F to say this is the file location. I forgot the dash F on there. Okay, fine. We can do this. Do you want to have a passphrase? Do you want to have a passphrase in addition for Bob? Again, I'm saying no. I'm just going to leave it blank for now. You could have some extra security and add on additional passphrase. And again, I'll just hit enter again. And it goes and generates some new keys here for the Bob user. So if I take a look in here, I now have ID _ Bob _ key. And I have ID _ Bob _ key.pub, right? I have a new pair of keys. These are not being used on the server for different clients to connect. These are specifically going to be made for my Bob user. Now, an important part of understanding some of these user-specific configurations is we're back to that hidden .ssh folder. So realize users can have hidden .ssh folders in their home directory where you can put some of this important information. So let's take a look. Does Bob have one right now? If I do an ls of /home/Bob and I toss on the -a option to be able to see, look at all the hidden stuff as well, you see, well, Bob kind of has a brand new user. He doesn't even have a .ssh folder yet. This hasn't been created yet. It's like, well, we could make that for him. I could go and make a hidden folder in Bob's home directory. We know how to make folders, right? I could do an mkdir /home/Bob/.ssh. Yeah, sure, that's something that I could go and make for him. And of course, I'm creating this for another user, so let's not forget my sudo, right? We'll need sudo as we go about doing a lot of this. We don't have permission to make folders in Bob's home directory, so let's do this as sudo. And now let's go ahead and run that command again. If I do an ls of /home/Bob-a, we'll be able to see, hey, there it is. Bob now has a .ssh folder that's currently located inside his home directory. All right, and since we just made it, it's brand new. Of course, there's nothing in there. And if Bob connected to different servers, Bob would now start getting those known host files that would start showing up inside his .ssh folder. Now, we're not interested in the known hosts. That is useful when a client wants to connect and remember the servers that they've connected to from a security perspective to see if the keys ever change in the future. That's really what that's useful for. What we're trying to do is say someone could log in as Bob but not use a password. They'd be able to use some keys instead. And so what this requires is a different file inside that .ssh folder. So I'm going to go ahead and make that file right now. I could have something like sudo, and then I'm going to copy the public key to that particular location. All right, so here's the important thing to understand. I'm going to copy that public key that I created to a new file that's inside that .ssh folder. So here we go. I'm going to do sudo copy, and then I've got this ID _ Bob _ key.pub. That's the key that I want to copy. I want to take his public key, and I'm going to put it inside a new file inside .ssh. All right, so where is that? /home/Bob/.ssh. There's currently nothing in there, so I'm going to make a new file, and I'm going to call it authorized _keys. So this is another critical file. We learned about the known hosts. We're also learning about the authorized keys file. This is another critical file to learn about. So your authorized _keys file, the benefit of using this is any public keys that exist in a user's authorized keys file, if someone shows up to the server and they can prove that they have the corresponding private key, the server will let them in. So we're taking this public key and specifically putting it in a spot specifically for this particular user. Let's give that a try. All right. So now we've gone and created this authorized keys file inside the .ssh folder, and it's specifically the public key. So anybody who shows up with the private key, anybody who shows up with this corresponding private key, they'd be able to prove that they have the corresponding private key through SSH, and then they'd be able to connect to the server, and it would never ask them for a password. Say, nope, this is another way you can prove that you can take on the Bob identity here on this computer, and you're authorized to do that. Okay, now another thing you want to be real careful about is we're setting up a lot of this stuff using the sudo command. So as you start making files kind of from scratch here with the sudo command, you want to pay close attention to what are the permissions and what's the ownership that's happening when you go and do this. And this is a reason why you want to learn that little cheating command that I said kind of does all this for you. I'll show you that one here at the end. But I want to emphasize, pay close attention to the permissions. We were learning keys need to be locked down in a specific way. So you can run into permission and ownership problems when working with keys if you make the keys too publicly available. I've seen a lot of students where they're not quite sure what they're doing and they make their keys like 777. They give everyone access to the key. And then SSH says, well, I'm not going to trust this key. I'm not going to trust this key unless it's been locked down appropriately. So let's check some of the permissions on the keys by doing an ls-l. Right, we could check the permissions on the keys that were created when I ran the keygen command. So you can see here I've got this id_bob key and the key.pub. You notice they're currently owned by root because I ran that with the sudo command. And notice the private key, right? Only the owner of the file can read and write to this. Everyone else has no permissions. Look at the key.pub. The key.pub has only read permissions to everyone else. So people can read the file, but they can't write to it. And that's a critical thing as well. You've got read-write for the owner, but then just read. Notice this is different than the default permissions when you make a file from scratch. If you touch a file, like the Kali user did a moment ago, right? Kali was here. Notice this gives read-write to the owner, but it also gives read-write to the group. So the key permissions are slightly different. So if you want public keys to function properly, you need to make sure your key permissions are 644, not 664, which is what happens when you make files from scratch many times. All right. So pay close attention to your file permissions and realize that file permissions on your public keys and your private keys can really make a difference. So notice the private key has to be 600. So 600 on our private keys, 644 on the public keys, and revisit the permission sections if you don't remember exactly how a lot of that stuff works. Let's check the permissions of what happened when we created some of this stuff and when we copied some of this stuff over in the Bob location, right? So if I do like a sudo ls-l now of /home/Bob, let's add on the -a/ls-a, right? And let's look at that .ssh folder. It's like, oh, we made a folder for Bob, but we used root in order to do it. Whoops. So because I used root in order to do that, I used sudo. Now the ownership of this file, well, it doesn't actually belong to Bob. So we created something in Bob's home directory that Bob doesn't actually own. It's like, oh, okay. Well, what should the ownership and what should this be? Maybe we could kind of cheat and look at this over on a Kali machine, right? Over on the Kali machine, we do have ls-la here. We do have a .ssh folder for the Kali user, right? This .ssh folder for the Kali user on the sandbox side here. Notice what they have. They have full permissions to the owner. It's not owned by root. It's owned by the actual user itself, and everyone else has nothing. So that's 700 on the .ssh folder itself, and it's owned by the user. That's not really what we have over on the Ubuntu machine because we've been creating this from scratch. So this is something that the built-in commands kind of do automatically for us, but I think it's good. I think it's good to still build it yourself from scratch and learn what's happening. So let's figure out how to change this. Like, we can change these permissions. All right. So I need to now change the ownership of this, and I need to change the permissions of that .ssh folder that I made using the sudo command. So let's give it a try. Right. I could do something like a sudo chmod. We saw it was 700 of /home/bob/.ssh. That's the permissions that should be on the .ssh folder itself. So now we've got read-write execute specifically for the owner, and everyone else gets nothing. The other problem, of course, is that this is currently owned by root, and it should be owned by Bob. Well, how do we change ownership? Well, we got another command to be able to do that. We've got a sudo. We'll use sudo as well when we do this, and we could do a chown, right? Chown is how we can change the ownership of a particular file. And the useful notation to know about is you can specify who should be the owner of the file and what is the group that should belong to the file, and you could list both of them separated by a colon. So I could say if I want this file to belong to Bob, I could say Bob. I could then put a colon and say, what do I want the group to be? Well, I want the group to also be Bob. All right, so when I do a chown, I can change the ownership for both the owner and the group of the file all here in one just by separating them with a colon. So I can do sudo chown bob::bob, and I want this, of course, to be of /home/bob/.ssh. And if I do that and now check my permissions and check my ownership, it's like now it's not owned by root anymore, right? Now it's owned by Bob, and the permissions are now consistent with what the .ssh folder should be. All right, so we fixed the .ssh folder. What about the stuff inside? What about the stuff inside, right? If we look at inside the .ssh folder, it's like, well, we got that authorized keys, but we kind of have a similar problem. The authorized keys is there. It's named correctly, but the ownership isn't correct. The ownership also, again, this key is right now, it's owned by root and it needs to be owned by Bob. Well, hey, we know how to change ownership now. I could do a sudo chown of Bob:Bob, and I want to do this now on /home/Bob/.ssh, and then we'll do an authorized underscore keys. Authorized underscore keys, right? Let's go ahead and run that command, and then I'll hit a couple up arrows and check the permissions again, and we'll see, hey, my authorized keys file is now owned by the correct user. So the user has to own the directory and own the file that you currently want to use. This is not something that should belong to the system. It's something that should belong to the user. Also pay attention to permissions. If you touched this file manually, if you made this file manually, you would have 664 as the permissions, and that would be wrong. You need to have 644. Read write for the owner, only read for the group, and then read for everyone else. So you want to be careful if you're ever making this stuff manually, what are the permissions on this? And this is why I did a copy command as opposed to touching the file and trying to like send the data to the file, because when you touch a file, it won't oftentimes create the correct permissions necessary for a public key. All right, so just other good things to realize if your public key authentication isn't working. You want to check the ownership. You also want to check the permissions. So I hopefully have done this correctly. I've got my ownership of the .ssh and the permissions of the .ssh correct, and I've got the ownership and permissions of the authorized keys file also correct as well. All right, so the last thing that we would need to do is to say, well, how can a user log in using this key now instead of using a password? And we said the way that you would do it, of course, is they would have to have the public key, or excuse me, the private key. So we installed the public key into this authorized keys file for that user. Well, what about the private key? Okay, so whoever has this private key, that's the person who can prove that they indeed are the Bob identity. And so maybe we'll get that private key and we'll send it over to the Kali machine. Okay, so how can I get the private key over to the Kali machine? It's like, well, you could use the SSH service itself. Okay, so SSH, of course, is really useful for establishing secure connections, and it's also useful for securely copying files. So here's a service that you can use that will leverage an existing SSH connection, and that's Secure Copy, SCP. So from the Kali machine, I can use the scp command to copy files using an SSH server. All right, and this works very similar to the copy command, just cp. The difference now is you can now reference things that are on another computer. So if I want to take Bob's key and I want to put it here on the sandbox users, maybe here in their home directory, I could do an scp and say, what's the thing I want to copy? Well, the thing I want to copy is actually located on the other computer. Well, that's okay. I can just use this SSH remote, notation. I could write something like this. I could say sandbox at 192.168.8.2. That's the place where I want to go. I want to go to some other computer. I don't want to go to a folder on my computer. I want to go to some other computer. And where am I going on that computer? Well, where's the file? Where's the thing I'm trying to copy? And the important detail here is that you would write out the username at the IP address and then put a colon. Okay, so no spaces in this, sandbox at 192.168.yourteamnumber.2, colon, and now put the file path. What is the file path of the thing that I'm trying to copy? It's like, well, it's in /home/sandbox/ what did I call the file? It's like, well, I called it ID_Bob_key. That's the private key, right? And right, we'll double check our location. It's in /home/sandbox. So /home/sandbox/ID_Bob_key. That's something that exists on the 192.168.8.2 computer, right? So I've got my ID_Bob_key space. So that's the thing that I want to copy. Okay, where do I want to copy it to? Like, I could put any file path, I could put any location, I could say, where do I want to copy this to? And a good notation to know about is you can do a single period to say here. So wherever your current working directory is, a nice little quick way to do that is to just put a single period. So that's the same as, right now, that would be the same as typing out /home/sandbox, right? That would be the same thing. Or I could put, well, I want to copy it to my home directory, and my home directory is just tilde. right? So I could copy it to tilde. Yeah, that would work. Many times I like to use I'll just copy it to where I'm currently located, and so we'll use the dot notation. So I could say copy this thing from this other location, the Bob key, using logging as the sandbox user, and bring it over here to my computer, and we'll just put it here. Okay, let's try this. Okay, so I was going to say, confirm that you know Sandbox's password. It's like, yes, I know Sandbox's password. I can confirm that as Sandbox. And, oh, we've got a permission denied, right? Why do I have a permission denied? Why would it not let me do that? Well, let's go check the permissions on this, right? What were the permissions on this particular file? It's like, well, we're trying to copy a key. Oh, it currently belongs to root. I'm trying to copy something that I can't read as the Sandbox user. So maybe I would change the ownership on this private key as well, right? So if you're trying to copy something and you don't have permissions, maybe you have to change the ownership on the thing you're trying to copy. Maybe you have to take your command and try running your command using sudo. It's like, can you run the scp command using sudo instead? So two different ways to kind of think about the problem. Does the user you're logging into have access to the thing that you're trying to get? And also realizing, of course, just like you can run the copy command using sudo, we could also run the scp command using sudo. Will that solve our problem? I don't know. Let's give it a try. All right, we'll confirm our password again as password and say, hey, we're about to establish a connection to this computer. Are you sure you want to do that? Like, yes. Yes, I want to establish this. Okay, confirm that you've got the password to log in. Password, sure, we'll go ahead and do that. Oh, permission denied. Yep, still not giving us access to that. So this is a common thing where people are like, yeah, but I added on sudo. Why do I not have permission? It's like, well, yeah, but you don't have permission over here to this file, right? It's Sandbox user on this computer doesn't have access to this. So we know how to fix that though. So before I try copying this over, yeah, we gotta pay attention to ownership. We gotta pay attention to permissions. So I'll do a sudo chown. chown, I'll change the ownership to sandbox:sandbox, so then this user actually has permission to this file. And of course the file I want to change is id_bob_key. Yeah, sure, let's give that a try. And now if I check my permissions again, it's like, hey, now the ownership of this is something that the Sandbox user can actually access. Okay, let's go back over to our Kali machine. Maybe now if I hit a couple up arrows here and try running this again, it's like, can I actually scp this file over as the Sandbox user? I don't know, let's give it a try. I'll try logging in password and say, hey, now the file actually copied. Whew, we got there. So scp is a really useful command. You can now leverage copying files from other computers and bringing them over to your computer. And of course, we could kind of flip the notation. If there was something on my computer that I wanted to push over to the server, I could copy a file locally and then simply say the location I'm trying to copy it to is sandbox at an IP address. So yeah, you can leverage SSH servers to be able to log in and move files around using something like SCP. Okay, fine. So let's check the permissions here. Let's see what happened, right? If I do an ls-la, right, and I take a look at what's actually here inside my home directory now, remember I've got that Bob id_bob_key, here it is, owned by the Sandbox user, and the permissions are correct. I've got a read, write, and nothing else. Okay, so good way to be able to copy this file over, and we pay attention to that ownership, we pay attention to permissions anytime we're trying to do stuff like this. Okay, so now the private key is here on this Kali computer, on the internal Kali, and it wants to try to connect to the Ubuntu computer without using a password, right? Passwordless authentication. How can we do it? It's like, well, before when I wanted to log in as Bob, I had to do SSH of Bob at 192.168.8.2, right? That was the whole point. I wanted to try logging in, and it said, well, you got to type Bob's password in order to get in. It's like, well, okay, fine, I'll type exit. Well, what if I wanted to log in as Bob and not use the password? Now that I've set up public key authentication, provided I haven't made any typos, it's like I should be able to now prove that I actually have the corresponding key and see if we can log in here without a password. Let's give it a try. So if I now try logging in as Bob, SSH, this time I'm going to add on the -i option. And the -i option says I'm going to use a Keyfile. So don't just log in using a password, log in, but try to log in using a Keyfile. And now you'd have to say, what's the file path to the key that you want to use, right? Sandbox / and then what did I call it? id_bob_key. And in order for the -i option to work, you have to have that ownership correct, and you have to have those permissions correct. If your Keyfile has the wrong permissions, then this will fail. right? And of course, if any one of those permissions along the way was incorrect, this will also fail. So you have to make sure you're very, very specific with the ownership and with the permissions when you're setting this up. Okay, and who do I want to log in as? I want to log in as Bob at 192.168.8.2, right? That's the location where this hopefully has been set up. And now if I hit enter, I'll be able to try to present that key, and notice it never prompted me for a password. It just said, hey, yeah, you were able to prove you had the corresponding private key for Bob. It was in the authorized keys for the Bob user, and so that's a valid way that you could connect to the computer. So now I have a way with this private key. Anybody who has this private key would be able to remotely log in as Bob, and it would never ask for a password. So what happens if I change Bob's password? Right, what happens if I go back over to the machine and I lock down the passwords and I change the password to something that's actually really secure? It's like, well, this isn't going to care. You can make the password whatever you want as the Bob user. Because I can now log in using public key authentication, it says, well, no, you're also a valid user. You found a different way to validate yourself to the server. So very critical that we understand when you have user accounts, when you have servers, do you have an authorized keys file? Does this user have an authorized keys file, right? If I look at my sandbox user, right, if I look inside my .ssh folder, for my sandbox user, they don't have an authorized keys file. So no one could log in this way using the sandbox user, at least not here with our .ssh with the authorized keys. Like, that wouldn't work. But for the Bob user, they did have an authorized keys. So paying attention to which users have authorized keys, you can change passwords all day long. If they have an alternative way to authenticate to the computer, somebody else could still log in. And of course, we're seeing how critical now it is to keep your private keys actually secure and only transfer them to places that you would actually trust. One last thing before I forget here, I don't want to leave us high and dry. I said I was going to show a command that could install some of this stuff for us. All right, so there's a very useful command for installing things for us, and that's what if I wanted to set up my public key authentication, and this time I want to install keys for a user, and I don't want to go through the process of doing the .ssh folder, creating the .ssh, or doing the authorized keys inside the .ssh and getting all the permissions correct and the ownership correct. Like, it's good to understand that. You need that knowledge to be able to troubleshoot, but maybe I want a command to just kind of go and set all that stuff up for me. It's like, okay, well, you could set up a pair of keys for a server, for a user, maybe like the sandbox user. So how about I do some set up some keys this time for the sandbox user. So I'll do a sudo ssh-keygen -type, just like we did before. What was that? ECDSA was our type, and our -f this time, the file that we'll make will be, /home/sandbox/ and this time I'll do like an ID_sandbox _key, right? So these are keys that I'm setting up for the sandbox user as opposed to the Bob user, something like that. So let's go ahead and generate some keys. All right, I'll have my password of password. I won't have a specific phrase that I'll add in, and it's like, okay, great, now I've got some extra keys. So I've got my ID_Bob for my Bob user, and I've got my ID_sandbox _key for my sandbox user. So right now, public key authentication not set up for my sandbox user, right? If I do an ls-a, I could go and check and see. It's like, I do have the .ssh folder, but was there anything inside there, right, of .ssh? It's like, well, I don't have an authorized keys folder file inside there. It's like, okay, what if I wanted one? Well, you can do it all in one command, and there's a very useful command to learn about, and that would be sudo, and then you've got ssh, and then it's ssh-copy-id, -copy, and then -id. Whoop, no space in there. -copy-id, if I can type it. There we go. Sudo ssh-copy-id. Very useful command for taking stuff and installing it on a server. Okay, so let's give it a try. I could take something like this and say, what's the key that I want to install? What are the keys that I want to install? Where are they located? Okay, it's like, well, I just created this ID_sandbox _key. That's the key that I just went and created. Let's give it a try. So I had that ID_sandbox ID_sandbox _key. Okay, this is a file that I just went and created, and I want to be able to install this file using this particular command. Let's not forget the option. Let's do a -i for this is the key that I'm looking to install, the ID_sandbox _key. There we go. And as I'm setting this up, I want to also make sure that I say, okay, this is a key that I'm going to install. Well, what user are you going to be installing this for? So I could say, well, I'm going to install this at the server. sandbox at 192.168.8.2, right? This is the server where I want to go and now install this key. So you can take a key that you've generated using the key dash command. Don't forget the -i option like I did to start, and try running this command to install this as the sandbox user. Let's give this a try. Okay, and so it's going to say, okay, we're going to take this key, we're going to try installing it on this server. Are you sure you want to connect to this server? Yes, we're actually kind of connecting to ourselves. It's like, yes, that's okay. Let's go ahead and type in our password to prove that we can do this. And it says number of keys added was 1. So it took the key that we did and we installed it on our own SSH server. Let's see, did it work, right? If I do an ls dash of our .ssh folder, we'll be able to see we now have an authorized keys file that's been set up. And what's inside it, right? If I cat out my .ssh/authorized keys inside my sandbox user, it's like, hey, I've got this new public key. This is a new public key that just got created here. And what did this correspond to? Right, it corresponded to this public key, the ID underscore sandbox underscore key dot pub. Right, so if I cat that one out, the ID underscore sandbox underscore key dot pub, I might need a sudo on that. You'll be able to see that was, oops, I did the private one, not the public one. There we are, key dot pub. There's the public key. Right, so doing something like this is a way that you could take something and install a public key that already exists using your SSH -copy-id command. So ssh-copy-id-i, and you notice that sets the permissions on things. If we do like an ls-la, right, to be able to see, it's like, hey, the SSH folder was already there, but it would have created it if it didn't exist. If I were to do something like .ssh to be able to look at the authorized keys, it set the ownership correct on the authorized keys, it set the ownership correct on the, or the permissions correct on the file, and it put the public key in there for us automatically. So nice command to be able to know about if you want to install keys on a server. That's a really quick way you can go and kind of do it all in one step. But still, if things aren't working along the way, you want to definitely troubleshoot what might have happened if you're doing things by hand. So